Hi everyone, and welcome to our Salary on Understanding Salary Projections. I'm Anita Collins, and I'm the Change Management Manager for Connect Carolina. Here with me today are...
I'm Jackie Treschel with the Connect Carolina Change Management Team.
And I'm Chris Lawless with the Commitment Accounting Team, and Robin is not with us this morning.
That's right. We had a little drama this morning, but we're doing just fine. So Jackie and I are going to present the content today, and Chris is here to answer all the hard questions. So be sure to throw her some hard questions so she'll feel needed today.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the way the webinar is going to run today. As we typically do, we have the chat window on the side, and you can use the chat window to ask a question. So if you get those hard questions early on, you can go ahead and type them in. And we're going to keep track of them, and we're going to stop at the end of each section to answer the questions that have come up so far. And new for this webinar, we're actually going to use polling questions. So we're going to make it a little more interactive than some of our other ones have been. So you'll get a chance to check your understanding before we move on to the next section. But as always, we are recording today's webinar. So if you want to listen to it on your ride home, that would be awesome. And we'll be posting it on our website at ccinfo.unc.edu.
Okay, so there's a lot we could say about salary projections, but we want to keep it to an hour today. So today we're going to focus on the three factors that the system uses to calculate salary projections. And again, so there's a lot we could say, and we're just talking about those three factors, but there's more information in this reference card that you can find on the ccinfo.unc.edu website. So this reference card covers today's content, plus it talks about the actual formula that the system uses to calculate projections, and it also has some instructions for troubleshooting. So if a salary projection doesn't look quite right, it gives you some information on what you can look at to get it corrected. Okay, so before we dive into the details, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what a salary projection is. So a salary projection is an estimate of how much salary and fringe you can expect to pay for an employee going forward. So not in the past, only going forward, and it's by funding source. So you won't see one big salary projection for all of an employee's pay. You'll see it by each of the funding sources that fund their pay. So salary projections, they help you estimate how much money you'll have left on a grant or other funding source after you pay your employees. So that's such a big expense that it's helpful to go ahead and see how much money is left after you fund your employees. You can see the salary projections on Infoport reports.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about a little bit about when they're calculated and then recalculated. So salary projections are recalculated every weeknight except on holidays. And what that means is that somebody with HR access would use a funding swap EPAR to move an employee's funding to a different grant, say. And so the projection for that employee is going to be updated the night that the EPAR is fully approved and executed. So again, not when the person creates it, but once it's approved and it is scheduled to be paid that way. So after it's been executed, so that night is when the projection would be updated. And something else to keep in mind is that after each paycheck is paid and distributed, the system recalculates the salary projections for employees. And that's because, as Anita mentioned, projections are looking forward, so they're in the future. As soon as a paycheck gets paid, you're now in the past. So we're not looking past at what we've already paid. We want to look forward and go from there.
So quick question before we move forward. When you're saying, you said they get recalculated every weeknight, are you talking about Monday through Friday or Sunday through Thursday?
We are talking about Monday through Friday. So it is the workday weeknights. So the calendar here highlights the days in July. that the salary projections will calculate. You notice there's an X over the 4th. That's because it's July 4th, which is a holiday. So projections will be recalculated on Tuesday the 3rd and then again on Thursday the 5th, but they wouldn't be on that weeknight. All right. So now we're going to do a quick poll. And you can answer the question of how often salary projections are updated. So is it every night, every weeknight, or every weeknight except on holidays? We'll give you another, say, 5 seconds or so to click the radio button. And once you click submit vote, you're not able to change it. So just keep that in mind. All right. It looks like most everybody is on the same page. So every weeknight except holidays is when the salary projections are updated. And again, that's Monday through Friday. Great job, everyone. All right, so now we're going to talk about what those 3 factors are, and we're going to give you some high-level 2-word terms for each of those factors. So we're going to talk about employee group, funding sources, and end dates. If it were that simple, we wouldn't be having the webinar. So we're going to dive into each one of those individually and take a look at it. So we're going to start with employee group. So using our March Madness theme, coming off of basketball season, we're going to go with who's in and who's out. So the employees that are included in salary projection, so these are the employees that we are projecting for, are SHRA permanent employees, EHRA faculty, EHRA non-faculty, and then EHRA students, EHRA postdocs, and EHRA clinical fellows. I think most people just refer to the last 2 as postdocs and clinical fellows, but for our purposes today, I think it's important to note that they are EHRA for both of those. So that seems like a lot of people. So if all of those people are included, who's not included? We have 3 main groups. The first one is SHRA temporary employees. And that means they're either a temporary, so a regular or intermittent temporary employee, an SHRA retiree, or an SHRA student. And the reason that those folks are not included is because they log their hours in TIM. And so because they're paid hourly, we have no way to know how many hours they're actually going to work, and so we don't project for them. The next group is EHRA students on short work break. You notice in the included column, we did have EHRA students. So the distinction here is important, that it's those that are on short work break. If they are on short work break, they are not working. If they're not working, we're not paying, and so there's nothing to project. So that's kind of an easy way to think about that with those folks. And then the last group here is affiliates. And you'll notice I've got a little star by affiliates, and that's because affiliates are not employees of the university. If they are paid by the university, they're paid outside of the payroll system. And the salary projections are calculated within the payroll system, the payroll side of Connect Carolina. And so we can't move outside of there in order to project that. And also we don't have a way to know what we're going to be projecting for them. So those are the groups that are included and not included. And so what group the employee belongs to is important because it determines which fringe rate to use. The fringe benefit rate is different for SHRA and EHRA for things like insurance and retirement and that sort of thing. So now let's jump back into another poll and let's look at Chandra. So she's a part-time temporary SHRA employee at the School of Medicine. Will her salary be projected? So think about that for a second while I put the poll up. And you can go ahead and answer. So she's a part-time temporary SHRA employee at the School of Medicine. Looks like 93% so far think no. We'll give you another couple of seconds. All right, we're going to close it with 90% thinking no and 10% thinking yes. The correct answer is no. Because she is a temporary SHRA employee, we're not projecting for her. Again, because she's SHRA temporary, that means she's got to clock her hours in TIM, in and out. So just keep that in mind, that temporary employees we aren't projecting for. All right, one more. Let's check this one. So here we have Christoph. He's an active EHRA student at the School of Dentistry, so that means he's working. And will his salary be projected? So think about that for just a second. Let me launch the poll. Ooh, those numbers are rising quick. 100% think yes.
We have some dissenters.
All right, so we'll take another couple of seconds. Last chance for anyone else. And so we've got 97% that think yes and 3% that think no. The correct answer here is yes, because he is an EHRA student and he is active. His salary is going to be projected because he is working. So great job, everyone.
And so I think that those who entered no were thinking of the short break.
The short work break,
so remember,
right.
We don't project if a student is on short work break. Cool. Okay, so let's recap what Jackie just told us. So remember that employee group is important when calculating salary projections, and that's because the fringe benefit rate is different for EHRA versus SHRA. And then also the system calculates projections for all employee groups except for EHRA students on short work break and SHRA temporary employees. And again, just thinking about it logically, EHRA students, if they're on short work break, they're not getting paid. So we don't want to project that they are getting paid during that time. And then for SHRA temporary employees, we don't necessarily know exactly how many hours they're going to work. And so it's difficult to come up with an accurate projection for that group. So they do not have projections. Okay. Remember also that affiliates are not employees. So some of them are paid, but they're not paid through our payroll system. And so therefore the system does not calculate projections for affiliates. Okay, so shall we take just a minute to answer any questions that you may have so far?
I don't see any in there just yet.
No questions yet. Okay, let's move forward.
I don't see anything, so we'll keep going. That was the easy one. I know there's questions coming.
Yeah. Okay, so we just talked about employee group. Let's move on to the second factor, which is funding sources. Okay, so what is a funding source? So I think you guys probably all know what it is, but just to make sure that we're using terminology that you're familiar with. So funding source is basically a chart field string. So it's a source that funds an employee's pay. They are entered for an employee using an HR action, so on the HR side of the house. And they get stored on what's called a funding grid. And a funding grid just is what it sounds like. It's just a table that lists all the chart field strings that fund an employee. Okay. Okay. So when an employee is hired, and then later on it can be changed, on the HR side of the house, someone enters a hire action and they list all the chart field strings or all the funding sources that are going to fund that employee's pay. The funding sources can be 4 different kinds. So it can be state, F&A, trust, or it could be a project or a set of projects, which are basically contracts and grants. Okay. An employee could be funded by one funding source, or it could be many funding sources. And when those funding sources are entered, the person entering the action specifies what percent of the employee's salary that each of those sources should fund. So for example, one employee could be funded by 4 different sources, and 20% could be covered by the state funds, 10% could be F&A funds, and then maybe there are 2 projects that take up the rest. One is covering 30% and one is covering 40%. So then another employee could be covered mostly by state, so 90% by state, and another by the remainder by F&A funds at 10%. So it varies widely by employee, and the person entering those HR actions specifies which funding sources and how much each should cover.
And Anita, even though we have the examples here that have multiple, it is possible for an employee to just have one funding source, right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. So time for another scenario. So remember that we've covered funding sources, and we've also covered employee groups. So keep that in mind, trying not to make this a trick question. So Ethan is a permanent SHRA employee. 55% of his salary is funded by a federal grant, and the remaining 45% is funded by F&A funds. Will both of those funding sources show up on the salary projections? And so Jackie's going to get the poll loaded for us, and go ahead and choose your answer.
Show you guys the percentage here. The numbers are rising quick.
Wow, 100% already. Don't let your fellow webinar mates sway your answer. Choose the answer that you think is right. We give it another couple of seconds.
Another couple of seconds.
It's sticking a solid 100%.
It's staying at 100.
There is no fooling you guys. You are absolutely right. The answer is yes. Okay, let's try to make it a little harder for you then. Okay, so here's another scenario. Susan is an SHRA retiree, and she works part-time. 65% of her salary is funded by a research project, and the remaining 35% is funded by state funds. Will both of her funding sources show up on the salary projections? Okay, so Jackie's going to get the poll loaded, and go ahead and choose your answer. Oh, those numbers are flying. All right, so people are still entering answers. That's good. All right, looks like we've stabilized there.
Yep.
Shall we go
Doesn't
ahead?
look like anyone else is answering.
Okay, so good. I like to see all the answers covered there. This is a little bit challenging. So remember, Susan is an SHRA retiree, and she works part-time. So that is actually more of a factor right now than which funding sources cover which percent. So it's a little bit of a red herring there. Because she's a retiree and works part-time, that means she's temporary, and an SHRA temporary, and we're not projecting, doing projections for her. So I love the I'm not sure answer. That was very honest there. But the folks who voted no are correct in this scenario. So excellent. Good job. Thanks for doing the poll, everyone.
Okay, so we're just going to take a second and recap what Anita just covered with funding sources. And the first thing is that when an employee is hired, or when a change needs to be made, they're assigned 1 or more chart field strings that specify the sources that are going to fund their pay. And the funding sources can be state, F&A, trust, or project funds, which is contracts or grants. And an employee can be funded by multiple sources, and the person that's the one entering the funding specifies the percent that each source covers for that employee. And so now at the end of this section, we'll take a second and answer any other questions that we have. Lee chimed in with a question just after we moved on from the last section. It says, when you say fringe, you are referring to benefits, and that is correct. The fringe rate is for benefits. Heather just asked a question and said, in what circumstance would a person have a percentage of salary on F&A? And I'm going to be honest and say that's a hard question. So we're going to let Chris answer that.
It's totally dependent upon the department. Some employees may be funded by F&A sources. We have some that provide cost sharing on their sponsor projects by their F&A. So it just depends on the person, the department, and what funding sources they're using to pay those employees.
Heather says thank you.
Chris says you're welcome.
All right, if there are no other questions, we'll wait just a second here. This is the easy time. We're getting ready to get into some muddy waters here. All right, so we're going to move on. So we've covered factor 1, which was employee group. We've covered factor 2, which was funding sources. And now we're going to move on to factor 3, which is end dates. So let's talk a minute about what those are. And just at a very high level, here we've got a couple of people shaking hands. Our first end date has to do with the person. And the person that's working and the last day that they're going to work is what our first day is, which is the job end date. Our second date has to deal with the funds, when the funds are set to expire, so they can't be used anymore. So that's our funding end date. And then our third end date has to do with the budget period, when you're allowed to spend those funds. Once that time is come and gone, you can't do that anymore. So that's going to be our budget end date. And Anita's going to tell us a little bit more about what those dates are. And then we'll get into some examples for those.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about job end date first. So just as it sounds, it's the date a job is set to end. And it's specifically the last day the person will work if the job is set to end. So not all jobs have end dates. Their job end dates are mainly used for EHRA students who are not postdoc trainees or clinical fellows paid by stipend. Job end dates are not used for faculty members. And so by that I mean a faculty member could have a job end date set for them, but the salary projections, the system doesn't use that date when it's calculating salary projections. So that's a key thing we'll mention.
Hey, Anita. I'm sorry, it always hasn't been this way for faculty members, right?
That's right. So that's a good point. That actually that changed in December of this last year, and it was on request. So as we kind of spent more focus on salary projections and getting those the way everyone needed them to be, that was a change that was requested, and it was made, and it went into place last December.
Okay, great,
so,
thanks.
Yeah, good point. So job end dates are set using an EPAR form. And if they need to be changed, it's another EPAR form. And I know most of you are probably familiar, but EPAR forms, as Jackie mentioned, it's basically an HR action that is done in Connect, Carolina. All right, so that's job end date, the date that the job is set to end if it is. Okay, so the next date that is used in calculating salary projections is the funding end date. And so that means that's the date that the funding source, which we also call chart field strings, that's the date that the funding source is set to end if it is. So again, not all funding sources are set to end, but if they are, that's called the funding end date. The end dates for funding sources are entered when the chart field string is entered for an employee. So as we mentioned early on, when a person is hired, or sometimes if changes need to be made later, someone on the HR side enters an HR action and they specify all the chart field strings that are going to fund that employee. And if needed, they also specify an end date. So maybe the person is going to get moved to a different source later, or there's a variety of reasons why an end date could be set. So again, not for all chart field strings, but if needed, that end date will be set. Again, and it's using an EPAR form. That's how those dates are entered or changed.
Hey, Anita, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Heather asked another question about the difference between an EPAR and a PAT transaction.
Great question. Yeah.
Did you want to field that one?
Let's go ahead and answer that now. Yeah, that's a really important question. Thanks for asking that. So PAT, and for those of you who are not familiar, PAT stands for Payroll Accounting Adjustment Tool. But that is so hard to say. We all call them PAT. And it is for changing funding that's in the past. So it's retroactive funding changes. So changes that go forward are made using a funding swap tool. So PAT is basically for in the past, and remember, salary projections look forward. They're in the future. So really, PAT
is historical paychecks only.
Yeah. So it doesn't really change your salary projections.
Right.
So what a great question.
And EPARs are going forward.
Yeah.
EPARs are going forward.
For an effective date going forward.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
Right.
Thank you. Thanks, Heather.
Yep. That was a good lead in.
All right.
Okay. So budget end date. So let's talk a little bit about the third date, the budget end date. And this is the one that we have to chew on a little bit to really kind of understand how this works. So it's really different. It's different. The budget end date is different depending on whether you're talking about state, F&A, and trust versus project. So let's kind of split those apart and talk about them separately. So let's focus on state, F&A, and trust first and talk through that. So for state, it's tied to the fiscal year, so July through June, and it looks at the paycheck. It looks at the last paycheck paid during the fiscal year. So let's break that down just a little bit more. So the last paycheck date during the fiscal year is different for monthly and biweekly employees. So for monthly employees, it's easy because they get paid 12 times a year. They get paid once a month. So that's usually the last paycheck paid in the month for monthly employees. For biweekly employees, we get paid twice every other week, and it doesn't neatly fall at the end of the month. And so when we're talking about the date of the last paycheck before the end of the fiscal year, we're saying that for biweekly employees, that's the date of the last paycheck that's actually paid during the fiscal year. So it's actually paid out before the fiscal year ends. So the system is going to, calculate through that date. So it's actually the end of that pay period that's actually going to get paid. So I know there's a lot to chew on. So we're going to go through that again.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Just so thinking about that in sort of real life with this year.
Mm-hmm.
So SHRA employees, their last paycheck for the fiscal year is June 22nd. Am I right, Chris?
Yes.
And that's for the pay period that ends on June 10th. So the June 10th, we're only going to project out for SHRA employees that are paid on state funds through June 10th. Is that correct? Because the rest of June is paid in July, which is the next fiscal year.
Correct.
Is that
and
correct?
Once we are moved into July and all of the June payroll has been paid, then we will begin projecting on fiscal 17 for SHRA employees.
Yeah.
But not until after all the June pay has been posted.
Yeah. And so just to mention that because biweekly employees are paid on a lag, an employee may actually kind of earn pay before the end of the fiscal year, but it's actually when that pay is paid out that's used in salary projections.
Okay. So we've had two questions come up real quick.
Okay.
Kathy asked, why don't we accrue for June payroll expenses in the fiscal year versus hit in July?
Because the budget is set up for what actually pays within that budget year. So because for example, the B26 pay cycle, even though it covers June dates, specifically this year is June 11 through June 24, the paychecks won't actually be paid until July 6th. So it's considered fiscal 19 expenses. And so we don't project them as fiscal 18 projections because they wouldn't be on the fiscal 18 budget period.
Okay. And then Angela asked if we could repeat the dates again. And Angela, are you talking about the June dates for the end of the pay period? If so, that was the end of the pay. Yes. Okay. The end of the pay period is June 10th, and the paycheck for SHRA employees is June 22nd for this year. And so
you can go to the payroll website, and there is a link for the biweekly, monthly, and summer school pay schedules. These will have school deadlines for submitting your EPARs, the lockout dates, as well as the day that we confirm we end the lockout, and then when we actually pay the employees. It's very helpful to know for deadline's sake.
Yep. And we're going to give you that link at the end, actually. We included that link to where the payroll calendars live. All right, so that covers the state and FNA.
I know, so we're halfway through.
But she said it's different for project funds, right, Anita?
That's right. That's right. So let's talk about those. And you know, if you think of other questions on this topic, just go ahead and type them in, and we'll have another round of question answering in just a little bit. But so thinking about for projects, so the budget period for projects is not tied to the fiscal year. It's based on what the sponsor says it will be. So it's a year period, but doesn't necessarily match our state's fiscal year. Or it could be multiple years. So a budget is set by the sponsor, and it's kind of when they decide or how they decide to release the funds. So that budget period, the budget end date would be the end of that, say 1 year period or multi-year period that the sponsor has, agreed to. So again, different than state and FNA and trust. It's based on the sponsor. It could be a year. It could be more than a year.
All right.
Okay, so we cover those 3 dates and kind of what each of those dates are. Now Jackie's going to take us into how the system uses those dates to calculate projections.
All right, thanks, Anita. So you see I've got a timeline up here. And we heard Chris talking about biweekly and B26 and that sort of thing. And so anybody that's in the HR payroll world or knows people in that world, they tend to talk in terms of like M6 and B26 and M3, that sort of thing. And all they're talking about is whether it's biweekly or monthly. So M6 is monthly pay period 6. And B26 is biweekly pay period 26. So you see the timeline here that I'm showing is covering B13 to B20, and this is just an example. This isn't real time of where we are. But the system calculates projections for a time period that starts on the first day of the current pay period. Remember, projections are looking forward. So we're going to start with the current pay period and go forward from there. And then they end on a date that varies based on the answers to 3 questions. So those questions are, does the employee's job have an end date? Which is, Anita told us about that job end date. So basically, if an employee is no longer working, we're not going to project a salary because they're not getting paid. So if their job end date has come, then we're going to stop projecting. The second is if the funding source, again, it's the chart field string, has an end date. And that could be the funding end date or the budget end date. So if the funding source is set to end, it's looking at one of those 2 dates. And then the third is what type of fund is it? So is it state FNA or trust, or is it a project fund? So now we're going to break those down and look at them a little more specifically in 2 groups. So we're going to look at state FNA and trust first, and then we're going to move on to project. So for state FNA and trust funds, the system is going to use the earliest of those 3 dates. So the job end date, the funding end date, and the budget end date. Because again, if the person's not working, we're not going to project for them. If the funding source is expired, there's no money to project for them. And if the budget period is over, in this case, it's the end of the fiscal year, then you can't spend the money past when you're allowed to. So let's look at concrete dates for that. So we have an employee here. The job end date is April 30th, 2018, so it's coming up soon. The funding end date is September 15th, 2018. And the budget end date, because we're dealing with state funds, is June 30th, 2018. So the system is going to use the earliest of those 3 dates, which is April 30th. So the projections for this employee would only go out through the end of April. So looking at another example, we have an employee with a job end date of June 30th, 2019. So that's a little over a year from now. And a funding end date that's blank. There's nothing in the funding end date, which is possible when you have state F&A and trust funds. And then the budget end date is 6/10/2018. So this must be an SHRA employee that we're looking at here. And because that's the earliest, that's coming up here in a couple of months, that's the date that the system's going to use. It's the earliest of those 3 dates. So for state F&A and trust, it's a little bit simpler because, you know, you're only going to go out to the end of that fiscal year at most. So that's where it's a little bit simple on those. Understanding the paychecks and the difference between monthly and biweekly is a little bit tricky, but the dates themselves are pretty straightforward. So we're going to move on to contract and grant funding. Again, the system is going to use the earliest of the job end date, funding end date, or budget end date, and it's going to go out as much as 3 calendar years in the future. So it's not going to stop at the end of the state's fiscal year. As Anita mentioned, the fiscal year end doesn't often coincide with the end of a budget period on a project. And so now we're going to look at some of these dates. And you'll notice a note at the bottom here. What I'm getting ready to talk about does not apply to postdoc trainees and clinical fellows who are paid by stipend on NIH training grants. So put those aside for just a minute. We're talking about all the others in that group of who's included that we talked about before, but we're going to talk about them specifically in a minute. So looking at our end dates, we're going to use the same sort of example. So we have a job end date for this person of May 31st, 2019, so a little over a year from now. The funding end date is September 15th of 2018, and the budget end date is July 31st of 2018. So the system is going to use the July 31st of 2018 because it's the earliest. And there may be more funds coming. They may extend another budget period, but what the system shows right now is that this is the end of the budget period. So we can only project out through the time that the system says we can. Looking at another example, our employee has a job end date of September 30th, 2018. The funding end date is all the way out in September 30th of 2022, and the budget end date is September 30th of 2021. So the system is going to use, as I mentioned, the earliest date, which is the September 30th, 2018, because that's when the person is no longer going to be working.
So Jackie,
Yes.
Why is it only 3 years into the future?
It's based on the payroll calendars that are loaded into the system. We can only project out as far as the payroll calendars are loaded into the system, and they're loaded out as much as 3 years into the future. All right, let's do another couple of poll questions. Keeping in mind that all 3 factors you have to look at now. We started with those easy ones, but now we've got to move into considering all 3 factors. So you've got your employee group, your funding source, and your end date to look at. Our scenario is that Marcus is an EHRA research assistant whose appointment is set to end on February 28th, 2019, and 100% of his salary is from a federally funded grant that ends August 30th, 2019. What day does the system use to calculate the projections? So think about that for just a minute. And oh, and that poll question is not the same as what's on the slide.
Uh-oh.
But you guys all so far are correct. You're getting it.
We're not seeing that.
Yeah, I see that.
Okay.
All right, so let's All right, let's work with the one that's on the poll question. Sorry about that for those of you that answered the question from the slide. We made a last minute change and yeah, so the date that's on here is September 30th, 2018, is when the project ends. So this is completely my bad. I'm going to take responsibility for this one. So the correct answer for the question that's on the poll that's showing right now is in fact September 30th, 2018. It's the earliest of those two dates. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and look back at this one. And had this actually been what was showing up on the poll, you are correct. The answer would have been February 28th, 2019, because it is the earliest of the date. So again, my apologies for that. Extra trick question that even I didn't catch. All right, let's try another one. All right, so we have Annie, who is an active EHRA student whose appointment is set to end on April 30th, 2019. Currently, 100% of her salary is from a federally funded project that ends on September 30th, 2019. However, she is only funded on the project through December 31st, 2018. What date does the system use to calculate the projections? So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. No, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Okay, we're having technical difficulties because this poll is not on here. So anyone in the room want to take a guess? Or if you want to type it in, there you go, we can type it in the chat window. So we have JLA that said December 31st, 2018. We've got a bunch of those coming in so far. So that is in fact correct. It is the earliest of those three dates. And because she is an EHRA student, we do look at all three of those. And so the date that the projections will use, even though the project goes out through September of 2019, her appointment goes till April of 2019, but she's only funded on the project until December 31st of 2018. Okay, one more. And I'll warn you in advance, this is a trick question. So we have Andre, who's a professor, and his appointment is set to end on July 30th, 2018. 65% of his salary is from a federally funded project that ends December 31st, 2018. What day is the system going to use to calculate the projections? We do have this one in poll form. The answers are moving here. I'm liking that nobody took my trick answers there. Nobody's picking those too. But we seem to be a little split about whether it's his job end date or his the budget end date of December 31st. So we'll give it just a couple more seconds and then we'll close the poll. Remember, he's a professor, which makes him EHRA faculty. All right, we're going to go ahead and close the poll. The correct answer is, in fact, December 31st, 2018, because he is EHRA faculty. And as Anita mentioned before, we no longer use job end date for faculty members when it comes to projections. So even if they have one, the system's not looking at it to calculate it. Great job, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there with our technical difficulties. The last thing we're going to talk about with those end dates are those postdoc trainees and clinical fellows that are paid by stipend on NIH training grants. So you see here that I've got the job end date, the funding end date, and the budget end date all showing. However, for those folks, their job end date and the budget end date don't always align with their NIH appointment. And so a decision was made that the funding end date is the only date that's going to be looked at when it comes to projections. And the funding end date is manually entered by our commitment accounting team,
AKA
Chris Lawless, to match their statement of appointment. And their statement of appointment end date may be different. It likely is different from their job end date from their appointment at the university. And it's probably likely different from the budget end date of the grant as well. But the only date that is going to be considered is that funding end date. So here, looking at one of our concrete examples again, if we have somebody whose job end date is listed as May 30th, 2019, their funding end date as entered by Chris Lawless is September 15th, 2018, and the budget end date is July 31st, 2018. Even though that budget end date is showing is earlier than the funding end date, the system's not looking at it at all. It knows that it's manually only looking at the funding end date. It's just sort of overriding the other two and just looking at that one. So there's our funding end date.
Okay, so that was a lot of content to cover. So be thinking of your questions and go ahead and type them in. But before we answer questions, let's just do a quick recap. So remember that the system uses 3 dates when calculating salary projections. The job end date, which is the date the job is set to end if it is. So remember, not all jobs have end dates. And it also uses the funding end date, which is the date that the funding source is set to end. So that's the chart fill string. Again, not all funding sources have end dates, but if they do, that's a date that's in the mix. And then the last one is the budget end date. And that's talking about for state, trust, and F&A, that's talking about the fiscal year basically, and when that last paycheck is paid in the fiscal year. And for projects, it's based on that budget period that's set by the sponsor. So it could be a year or it could be multiple years, but it's the end of that period set by the sponsor. Okay, so which of those dates are used depend on what type of employee it is and the type of fund that the employee is paid from. And then remember, we kind of, I think, hammered that point a little bit with our trick question, but that even though faculty members may have a job end date, the system doesn't use it to calculate salary projections. So it just ignores that date, even if it is set. Okay, so of those dates, the system is going to use the earliest date that applies. So whichever one is the earliest, and if the date applies to the funding source or the type of employee, it will use the earliest one. Okay. Okay, so we're on the home stretch.
We're on the home stretch.
So thanks for hanging in there. And I don't see any new questions.
Nope,
no,
I don't see any in there.
So go ahead and type them if you can think of one. But so we've covered the employee group. So the 3 factors, again, the first one was the employee group, SHRA versus EHRA, and type of employee. Then we talked about the funding sources and the fact that basically those are the chart fill strings that are entered to fund an employee's pay, and what % each of those covers. And then we talked about the 3 end dates. So job end date, funding end date, and budget end date. And that is the bulk of our content. So
yep.
That's great.
A couple of things to keep in mind that we kind of touched on, thanks to some of your questions, but is that payroll accounting adjustments, so PAT transactions, are used to make historical changes, so they aren't going to change the salary projections. Again, because salary projections are looking forward and PAT is looking back. Another item that isn't included in salary projections is lump sum payments. We're only looking at regularly scheduled payroll for that. So your base and supplements are included, but lump sums are not. And for state F&A and trust funds, projections begin for the fiscal year when the next fiscal year starts. So we'll be projecting for those funds after the next fiscal year begins. And the last thing is you can find those payroll calendars on the finance website at finance.unc.edu. And just like Anita mentioned about the reference card before, you can do a search for payroll calendar and it'll bring them all up. And finally, that reference card that Anita mentioned at the end does have more information than what we've covered today. We've really just focused on the factors that go into calculating the salary projections. But if you need more information about where to find the end dates, the formula that the system uses, and most importantly, maybe what to do if the salary projections seem incorrect, a lot of that information is in the reference card at ccinfo.unc.edu.
Okay, so we actually have a question, so great. So Kathy asks, are supplemental appointments with salary included in projections? I'm looking at Chris for that one.
Yes, they are, as long as they are funded with a normal EPAR, so a higher EPAR and fund swap EPAR. But if you are paying supplements via lump sum, they are not projected.
Okay, good question.
Thanks. Chris, I have another one that came in from Connie. It says, how is the Social Security cap handled in the projections?
Excellent question. We do have the projections process looks at limits, and when people have reached that dollar level, we no longer project on them. So the highly compensated employees, we will stop projecting once their actuals taxes or benefits have reached that ceiling, as well as when their projections beyond that have reached that ceiling as well, then we won't project them on the future months within that calendar year if it's tax related.
Great, thank you. Beth has a question. Does that mean MCDs are not projected? And for those of you that don't know, MCD is mobile communication devices. So that's things like stipends for cell phones and that sort of thing. And I'm going to take a guess and then let Chris answer. I'm going to say they're not projected because they're a lump sum.
That's correct. They are established by an initial lump sum, and then the rest of them are fed into payroll on a monthly basis. But they are not part of an employee's regular funding sources to pay their salary. MCDs are not actually salary.
Great. All right, great question. Any other questions? We've got about 6 minutes left, it looks like. And while I'd like to think we hit everything, I'm sure we didn't.
So I have a question, before we roll off, I do have a question because Jackie and I talked about potentially doing a part 2 for this webinar. And what do you think about that, where we could talk about troubleshooting and the formula that's used to do the calculations? And just wondering if you had an interest in a second part 2 webinar on salary projections.
If you do, just let us know in the chat.
Yeah.
You can just say yes or no.
Yeah. Yeah.
We got a for sure and a most definitely. All right.
Okay. Yay. Great. Okay. Okay, cool.
Right.
Thanks, you guys.
All right, we will put that in the works.
Yep. Oh, great. You like the polling? We do too.
Yeah.
we need to work on it just a little bit, take a little practice, but that was great. That's great. Great.
All right. So the last slide we're going to show is our Connect Carolina. If you need to get in touch with us, if you don't subscribe to our newsletter,
please do.
You can go to ccinfo.unc.edu and sign up for it. If you have questions that are not help-related questions, just sort of general questions, you can send them to cc_communications@unc.edu. If you have salary projection specific questions that you'd like us to cover in that sort of deep dive webinar about salary projections, that's a good place to send them. Like, you don't need an answer right now, but it's something that's, kind of burning and you'd like to know the answer to. As always, if you need more information, and the webinar will be posted out later today on ccinfo.unc.edu. And if you need help of any kind, system help, help.unc.edu or 962-HELP. And also, you know, if you don't already, follow us on Twitter and Facebook to stay in the know.
Yeah. And I do want to mention, just to tag on, that if you have an urgent question, please call the help desk. Don't send the question to the CC Communications mailbox. We do monitor that mailbox, but we're not on, you know, watching it every minute like the help desk is constantly available. So do encourage you that if you have an urgent question, your help desk, the help desk is the best bet. So, and yeah, we are tweeting now and doing Facebook a lot more. So, you know, it's the place to be.
All right. So if there's no more questions, I think we'll wrap it up.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Have a great day.